Implicit bias refers to our tendencies to react differently towards certain people or things than others. For instance, we're more likely to reach out and touch a flower than a spider. Unfortunately, we are sometimes quicker to ascribe positive or negative attributes to some people than others. These reactions are called implicit because they often are measured faster than we can reflect on our reactions. They're also sometimes called implicit because if we do reflect on our reactions, we may not endorse them. For example, we may become aware that we've reacted differently to a man than we reacted to a woman, even though we do not endorse discriminatory reactions based on people's gender. The received view of implicit bias holds that these behavioral biases are shaped by experience and based on learned associations between particular qualities and social categories, including things like race or gender. So, if we're raised in a culture that values men differently than women, then we'll learn to value men differently than women. For example, we may learn to associate men with leadership and women with care, according to this received view. So, when asked to recommend someone for a position, we may unreflectively mention only men for leadership positions or unreflectively mention only women for helping positions. Some scholars have challenged the received view of implicit bias. They argue that implicit bias is not predicated on any associative process, and it's not necessarily unreflective. Their arguments rely in part on debiasing experiments. The idea is that if implicit biases are associative and unreflective, then certain experimental manipulations should not be able to change implicitly biased reactions. However, those manipulations have been able to change certain implicitly biased reactions, so implicit bias must not be associative and unreflective. Consider an example. If implicit bias is associative, then it would be learned and unlearned by pairing good and bad attributes with certain categories. So implicit gender biases would be conditioned by seeing men paired with certain attributes and women paired with other attributes. But if implicit bias operates according to logic and propositions, then implicit bias should also respond to arguments rather than just conditioning. So, for instance, if arguments about racial equality reduce people's implicit racial biases, then that would be a sign that implicit biases were changed not associatively, but propositionally or logically. So some scholars point to evidence that implicit biases have changed propositionally, and then concluded that implicit bias is not associative. One problem with some of these challenges to the received view is the quality of evidence. As social psychology has been reformed by the open science movement, the studies that have been marshaled against the received view of implicit bias have fallen out of favor for their insufficient sample sizes and statistical reporting. Another problem with this conclusion is that it doesn't follow from the evidence. Even if we found that implicit biases could be changed propositionally, this would show us only that implicit biases are not only associative. It could not show us that implicit biases are not at all associative. In other words, evidence of propositional changes in implicit bias is compatible with implicit biases being both propositional and associative. Now imagine that we find evidence for both the received associative view and the competing propositional view of implicit bias. This would give us evidence that implicit bias can be changed by either associative or propositional methods, both conditioning and logic. This would mean that neither the received view nor the alternative propositional view are fully adequate, and some combinatorial view would be better. I call this view the interactionist view of implicit bias. Interactionism about implicit bias claims that implicit bias can be predicated on associative and non-associative processes. So the major takeaways of this study are twofold. There's an opportunity to be more careful about the evidence that people cite in favor of certain views of implicit bias. We should make sure to cite evidence with sufficient sample sizes, appropriate analyses, transparent methods, and comprehensive reporting. There's also an opportunity to be more careful about what we conclude from evidence. Observing implicit biases changing as a result of one process does not preclude the possibility that it can change via another process as well. Think about it. If we found out that genetics influences weight gain and weight loss, we wouldn't conclude that calories no longer have any impact on weight gain and weight loss. Rather, we would conclude that both calories and genetics have an impact on weight loss and weight gain.